Education is not what some declare it to be. They say that knowledge is not present in the soul, and that they put it in, like putting sight into blind eyes. The capacity to learn and the organ with which to do so are present in every person's soul. It is as if it were not possible to turn the eye from darkness to light without turning the whole soul. So, one must turn one's whole soul from the world of becoming until it can endure to contemplate reality, the brightest of realities, which we say is the good. Education, then, is the art of doing this very thing, this turning around the knowledge of how the soul can most easily and most effectively be turned around. It is not the art of putting the capacity of sight into the soul. The soul possesses that already, but it is not turned the right way or looking where it should. The Republic, Book 7. These words come from Plato. Plato, whose philosophy and legacy trickled through the ages as though he were a saint or a mythic character. Fortunately, in our age of history, we know that Plato was a regular person, like you and I, who contributed an extraordinary amount of wisdom to the modern cultural heritage. I think that for many people, Plato is a sort of unknown figure who we all know exhibits an extraordinary amount of influence upon the ages which have succeeded his own. But for many, he is really no more than an obscure figure from the past whose philosophy is entirely unknown. Up until recently, about 2 months ago, I had no idea what Plato's true philosophy had been. I came across a few of his works which I had accumulated. The collection included the Republic, the Symposium, the Gorgias, and the Phaedrus. 2 iconic works and 2 other dialogues of his with a quality reputation. I opened up the Phaedrus to begin with, just to grasp a flavor of what it was which Plato was writing in 370 BCE. Then the unexpected happened. I became absolutely engrossed in the narrative and substance which this little dialogue provided. I watched Socrates meet a young scholar, and the two decided to take a stroll in the countryside, sit down by a creekside beneath a tree, and chat philosophy for a few hours, before returning to the city. Their dialogue ranged from discussions of myth and evidence to the valuable aspects of rhetoric, judgments on poor forms of wisdom by so-called professors, and finally, discussions of the nature of the soul and its potential for immortality. This kindled a little fire in me, and I decided to work through Plato's magnum opus, the Republic. I've now studied it a few times and read a slew of his other dialogues, the Symposium, the Gorgias, the Phaedo, the Protagoras, the Parmenides, the Timaeus, and the Cratylus. Plato's works are brilliant and mesmerizing, which makes sense considering that up until the day he met Socrates, he was training to be a tragic poet. Regardless of how good of a writer Plato was, I've come to find that to encounter, grasp, and understand Plato's philosophy is like receiving a divine code. Plato is a very controversial figure in the history of Western philosophy. He is probably the most quoted thinker, writer, and philosopher of all time. This is why Alfred Whitehead wrote, "The safest general characterization of the European philosophical tradition is that it consists of a series of footnotes to Plato." While it's possible to form a synthesis, uniting all of Plato's views into one general synopsis by tracking down all of the little arguments and points which Plato makes about truth, language, goodness, justice, beauty, social order, etc., I realized in my explorations of Plato that he really had one fundamental teaching of profound importance, and the rest was just noise. That teaching of profound importance is some of the most potent stuff I have come across in all my time reading philosophy, particularly the Western variety. I'm not kidding you. Every time I read the 6th and 7th books of Plato's Republic, I feel my pineal gland begin to light up and glow. It really feels like, in retrospect, that in Plato's fundamental teaching, Socrates offers you glasses with which you can gaze directly into the source of wisdom and see only its innermost essence. Now, before I go ahead and bring in Plato's fundamental teaching, let me share with you a bit more about the origins of Plato. You'd be surprised to know that this original innovator in the early days of the Western philosophical tradition was a bit of a wandering mystic with influences which may stretch back to Egypt and Persia. The origins of Plato. It really needs to be understood that Plato is by no means the father or the beginning of philosophy, nor is Socrates. There's two ways to think about the origins of philosophy. One is to be a historicist and determine the beginning of a historical phenomenon by the date of its first tangible recording, generally speaking glyphs or writing. Then there's the other way of speculating on the origins of philosophy, and that is to understand that the origins of the world and the processes of history exist within a pre-recorded era which the most we know is myth and folklore. So being the case, surely before the pre-Socratics and across other societies in Africa, the Fertile Crescent and the Indus River, there were other wise men, perhaps magi, who were the originators of philosophy. That being said, tangible history makes things more interesting. It makes the story feel more real and near to us. It lets us put a face and name to the abstract amorphous blob, which is the phenomenon known as philosophy. Many people consider Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle to be the historical founders of philosophy. This is false. There are a few people who have been recorded in the Greek tradition to be related to the origins of philosophy. The dominant portion of the first sources guide us back to Pythagoras, working in the 6th century as the father of historical philosophy. Pythagoras was primarily located in southern Italy and studied mathematics, geometry, harmony, spirituality, mysticism, and Gnosis. He founded a vegetarian commune in Croton and taught a system of ethics and morals. Other similar thinkers who were the near contemporaries of Pythagoras were the philosophers Heraclitus and Parmenides. Other second-hand sources, such as Aristotle and Diogenes Laertius, point back to the Milesian triad of Thales, Anaximander, and Anaximenes. These thinkers were reputed to have employed rational empirical methods to their research, similar to the way in which we understand modern science. This aspect of philosophy was originally termed natural philosophy before it was given the name of science. Regardless of who the historical father of Eurocentric philosophy is, it all at a certain point led to Plato. His work, thought, and writings can be clearly seen as a crossbreed between the philosophy of Pythagoras, Heraclitus, Parmenides, and it goes without saying, Socrates. Rumor has it that Plato's thought was in fact influenced by ancient Egypt, Persia, Mesopotamia, and perhaps even India. It is speculated from Plato's own writings and secondary sources that Plato traveled to southern Italy, Egypt, and the Near East. So these hypotheses are probably accurate. Additionally, Greek society had already been influenced by Egyptian and Near Eastern cultures. We see Pythagoras' thought clearly in Plato's work for a few different reasons. First and foremost, he mentions him by name repeatedly. It is also assumed that Plato studied in a Pythagorean cult during his travels to southern Italy. In addition, the peak of Plato's method for philosophical instruction includes the study of mathematics, geometry, and harmony, amongst other things. All of these are distinctly Pythagorean methods for philosophical knowledge. Parmenides and Heraclitus can be mentioned together as influences of Plato, as they both represent two sides of the same coin which Plato tossed. Parmenides stated that nothing comes from nothing, meaning that essential reality is ultimately unchanging. Heraclitus said the opposite, that everything is always changing, and he is reputed as writing the famous adage, "You never step in the same river." For Plato, ultimately, essential reality is an eternal and permanent truth. His basic argument runs like this. Truth can only ever be one thing, and the truth itself can never change, because the truth could never be false. So then the truth must be unchanging and eternal. Since everything in the world is only ever partially true and constantly in a state of flux, growth, and degradation, never permanent, it can't be the truth. So the truth must be a sort of transcendental phenomenon, like the very idea of the truth, which is the center of all knowledge and the point of philosophy. I think that this, along with other teachings of Plato, draws an intimate similarity with the Buddha, who interestingly enough was professing just a few decades before Plato. While it may seem contrary to the Buddha's teachings that there is a transcendental form which is the object of knowledge, I've come to find that the actual teaching we can obtain from a consistent dedication to meditation is that while the phenomenal world is always changing, i.e., the things you see rising and falling, coming and going, your life, your partner, the economy, food, drink, happiness, laughter, pleasure, and suffering, if you let go of these surface level matters, you actually uncover true reality. This is a striking parallel to Plato's thought. The final Platonic influence to cover is Socrates. Socrates is Plato's most immediate teacher, as they were together for a while before Plato's period of travels. From Socrates, Plato pulled particularly the art of dialectic, which he considered to be the most refined method of obtaining Gnosis, aka true knowledge of reality. And this is because it is only by way of dialectic that the mind is able to transcend itself rationally. This would be what, on the Indian subcontinent, has also been called Jnana Yoga. But also, from Socrates, Plato pulled ideas about virtue, goodness, truth, social order, and the living code of the true philosopher. The general synopsis of Plato's historical life is that he was Socrates' student and would be Aristotle's teacher. When he returned from his travels to Italy, Egypt, and modern-day Turkey, he founded a school called the Academy, which was the first institution of higher learning in the Western world and served as a model for later institutions, including the modern university. Otherwise, Plato wrote a series of books known as the Dialogues, and he is one of the most influential writers in history and in the canon of Western civilization. Plato's fundamental teaching. Now that I've been able to shed light on some of the details surrounding the origins of philosophy and its influences upon Plato's philosophy, we can dive into the essence of Plato, his fundamental teaching, which is single and unwavering. It all boils down to this, and from everything I've observed, he uses this method in every single one of his dialogues. There is an essential division between the world of bodily sense perception and the world of the soul's intellectual understanding. In fact, for Plato, the world of ideas, or forms, which he terms reality, are more real than the world of sensory objects, which he considers to be no more than shadows. Within this realm of the forms, for Plato, there is the highest principle or the most complete form of all, the form from which all the other secondary and tertiary forms are formed. This highest form he terms the form of the good, and the form of the good he likens to the existence of the sun. It makes all the sights of the world possible. It even gives form to the very world. I'll give you a few exemplary quotes to give you the gist of it. In the Republic, Plato writes, "The sun is not sight, but is it not the cause of it, and is also seen by it? Say then that it is the sun which I called the offspring of the good, which the good begot as analogous to itself. What the good itself is in the world of thought, in relation to the intelligence and things known, the sun is in the visible world." in relation to sight and things seen. Say, what gives truth to the objects of knowledge, and to the knowing mind the power to know, is the form of the good. As it is the cause of knowledge and truth, think of it also as being the object of knowledge. For the objects of knowledge, not only is their being known due to the good, but also their reality being, though the good is not being, but superior to and beyond being in dignity and power. When you read all of those, and I mean really read them, go back and entirely absorb their meaning, it really makes you think that Plato is describing his own rational view of the divine. It's interesting reading Plato because through the mouthpiece of Socrates, you always get this total logician building dialectical truths one-on-one with individuals. There's this very clear sense that Socrates will leave no stone unturned or uninvestigated, but he always comes back to the same problem. If you investigate something for long enough, any idea a person has or any phenomenon in the material world, it will eventually turn into a sort of ambiguous abstraction. Just like the very rules of mathematics, geometry, or even laws and customs. They're always predicated upon axioms which cannot be substantiated or proven. They simply are unproven requirements which make meaning and understanding possible. Take, for example, that I asked you, what is an atom? You would probably say, well, it's this tiny thing made up of protons, neutrons, and electrons. Then I would ask, but doesn't atom mean that it's the smallest, most indivisible thing in the world? This is literally the definition of atom, from Greek, indivisible. It was Democritus who formulated the idea that the world is made up of tiny indivisible particles, which are all the same thing. So then I could follow up and ask, what actually is an atom if what we call atoms aren't atoms? Well, as far as we know, electrons are indivisible, so those can be atoms. But aren't there other indivisible particles, like quarks, which are indivisible? If so, then neither quarks nor electrons are atoms. Then what are atoms? We can't see them, we don't know what they are, but there must be something which everything is made of, an essential substance which makes the world. Well, that's matter. But matter is made up of atoms? But what are atoms? This leads into a sort of spiral, which is what skeptics would call the truth. They would say that truth is actually unobtainable, that any judgment we have is just an opinion. Plato has a different point of view, and one which I actually quite like. He sees the unobtainable logical end, that perfect, eternal, immutable truth, and he states, that right there, that seemingly unobtainable and unchanging truth, that is the form of the good. It is the permeation of the divine, and it makes absolutely everything in reality possible. And our brains, our conscious perceiving apparatuses, are made of the form of the good and can perceive it. We can in fact train ourselves to make all of our judgments and actions align themselves with the highest principle of all reality. And unfortunately, it isn't quite tangible, nor is it necessarily rational. Woof. Far out. And Plato throughout his dialogues goes even further, making the point that if you align your life to the form of the good, your life will become good. You see, for Plato, the form of the good is flanked by what we call the transcendentals: beauty, truth, goodness, justice, and so forth. In his system, anything that is true is beautiful, and anything which is beautiful is true. Anything which is truly good and beautiful must also be just. But remember, all of these values, the way Plato uses them, imbues them with a transcendental sense of what is good. He's not saying, be a goody-good, obey any rule, or just because something is sexy and attracts you, that it is beautiful. His teaching is that one should meditate entirely on a transcendental awareness of beauty and goodness themselves, not an actual appearance of them, but literally the eternal principle of beauty, that is, the object of meditation. This is very different from philosophers of legalism like Confucius and Aristotle. The form of the good cannot be made concrete, for everything once it takes on a material form becomes corrupted and appears as nothing other than opinion. This has long duped many a philosopher, for what is required for understanding Plato and the form of the good is that the individual not only has sight and a brain, but that they also have vision and insight. Bertrand Russell is a great example of somebody who did not understand Plato's philosophy, which is a shame because, as he writes, he dedicated the largest amount of content in his infamous History of Western Philosophy to Plato. Russell's The History of Western Philosophy is a wonderful historical account of Eurocentric philosophy, but he really misunderstands some fundamental tenets of Plato in his assessment. An example of not understanding Plato would be the following. There is, at this point, a difficulty which seems to have escaped Plato's notice, although it was evident to modern idealistic philosophers. We saw that God made only one bed, and it would be natural to suppose that he made only one straight line. But if there is a heavenly triangle, he must have made at least 3 straight lines. The objects of geometry, though ideal, must exist in many examples. We need the possibility of 2 intersecting circles, and so on. This suggests that geometry, on Plato's theory, should not be capable of ultimate truth, but should be condemned as part of the study of appearance. We will, however, ignore this point. Of geometry, Plato actually writes, "Then, my noble friend, geometry will draw the soul towards truth, and create the spirit of philosophy, and raise up that which is now unhappily allowed to fall down." In all of Plato's writing, he clearly indicates that none of his teachings he recommends actually show you the truth. They only help the soul in getting closer to the truth, which in the end is a paradoxically formless process. Similarly, Russell claims that Plato encouraged people to study astronomy mathematically in order to find a perfect order or harmony, and that even though he was wrong in trying to find a perfect theory to match his metaphysical system, his theory helped the correct understanding in the empirical sciences. But this is also far from the truth. While Plato would have appreciated that science has improved at accounting for the movement of the cosmos, Plato's intent is entirely departed to even consider such a hypothesis as valuable. As Plato writes, "Perhaps you are right, and I am a simpleton, for I, on my part, am unable to suppose that any other study turns the soul's gaze upward than that which deals with being and the invisible. If anyone tries to learn about the things of sense, whether gaping up or blinking down, I would never say that he really learns, for nothing of the kind admits of true knowledge. Nor would I say that his soul looks up, but down, even though he study floating on his back, on land or sea." In order to see the map of Plato's metaphysical system, Plato gives us a useful tool in the Republic called the allegory of the divided line. He says to make a line which you divide unevenly, then you divide it by the same proportion once again on both sides of the divided line, giving you the following figure. In the bottom half, you have the least clear things, everything in the visible realm which can only ever amount to accurate opinion, but never knowledge. The most bottom line, the first thing you see, ikasia, are shadows, symbols of appearances, and reflections. Think of the screen you're looking at right now, and this video I've made. It's just an artificial depiction or manifestation of a real thing. That's level -2, shadows and reflections. The second level, technically level -1, pistis, are appearances, objects of sense, things animate and inanimate. Look at your hands, go into nature, look at your home or garden. All these things you perceive are appearances. Look at the nearest object. Is that actually a hand, or is it skin held together by bone and blood? Once again, the hand is an appearance. It's not the actual thing. The thing is a structure which is hidden from you, but which does exist if you examine it. Now we're on the third level, level 1, where we depart from the visible realm and we enter the intelligible realm, where true knowledge becomes possible. He calls dianoia mathematics and hypotheses. They're basically mental models which the mind formulates, similar to level -2, which is reflections of things from level -1. Level 1 are reflections of level 2, copies of the original fountain of reality. He states that in this level of awareness, people work with hypotheses, copies of true reality, and connect them to objects, non-reality. Rather than working back towards the first principle, the form of the good, it works the opposite direction. Think about the use of intelligence and mathematics to manage business, government, governance, groceries, etc. This is using intelligence to understand the visible world. Science as we know it today is entirely level 1 knowledge. That is, it is unable to comprehend its own axioms. We finally arrive at the highest level of understanding, level 2, which is understanding, what Plato calls Gnosis. In this section, the soul entirely lets go of hypotheses or even structures of thought without using the images from the realm of opinion. As he says it like this: "When I speak of the other division of the intelligible, you will understand me to speak of that other sort of knowledge which reason herself attains by the power of dialectic, using the hypotheses not as first principles, but only as hypotheses. That is to say, as steps and points of departure into a world which is above hypotheses, in order that she may soar beyond them to the first principle of the whole, and clinging to this, and then to that which depends on this, by successive steps, does she descend again without the aid of any sensible object. From ideas, through ideas, and in ideas she ends." This means that the soul alone, using intellectual intuition, is able to access the essential truth of all reality. For Plato, this is both the original principle and final conclusion of all philosophy, and the purest form of knowledge any mortal can strive for. In Book 7 of the Republic, Plato gives us recommendations for how to obtain the form of the good. He tells us what to do if we want to become philosophers and learn the form of the good. There are certain predispositions we need to have: moderation, a propensity towards goodness, a keen memory, healthy body, and sharp mind. We also need to study mathematics, geometry, astronomy, musical harmony, and most importantly, dialectic, through which one can comprehend the form of the good. Plato writes, "When a person starts on the discovery of the absolute light of reason alone, and without any assistance of sense, and perseveres until by pure intelligence he arrives at the perception of the absolute good, he at last finds himself at the end of the intellectual world, as in the case of sight at the end of the visible." What he's writing here is that if somebody pursues all of these studies with vigor and commitment, they will arrive at a point where they grasp the form of the good, and it is none of those particulars which they have been studying. From having studied Plato intimately, along with other personal practices and traditions such as Ashtanga Yoga, as set forth by Patanjali, and Tao, Zen, and Vipassana meditation, I believe that when Plato is teaching of the form of the good, he is teaching of a transcendental principle which is the philosopher's stone, the fountain of wisdom itself. In the Upanishads of ancient India, there is a very similar word in form and appearance, Sat Chit Ananda, which comes from the ancient Sanskrit literally translates to good consciousness bliss and is congruent to Brahman and the ultimate reality. It's absolutely fascinating to me how entirely distinct traditions, who most likely had very limited overlap, came to the same metaphysical realization using entirely different methods. Truth be told, I actually think that Plato's entire philosophical system can be seen as serendipitously mirroring that which Patanjali developed in India. In Patanjali's version of Ashtanga Yoga, first, the individual practices moral constraints and control over the beastly parts of human nature, gradually developing to a point of full mastery over human mind and body. These are called yamas, niyamas, pranayama, and asana. Then in the final stages of yogic mastery, there are 3 levels of meditation which are completed by absorption into Purusha, which can also be seen as congruent to Plato's notion of the form of the good. All in all, I think the case may even be made that Plato's method to bringing the form of the good is potentially not the best. While Plato's own thought seems to have indicated a transcendental union of subject and object, he certainly was a mind-body dualist. In many instances, Plato iterates that a complete negation and disregard for the body is required to obtain liberation. This as well has many parallels to the Indian tradition of renunciation. In my experience, there are many ways of knowing and reasoning which seem to be not dependent upon the mind, and also not dependent upon direct perception. Key places which seem to have access to the vision of knowledge, or noesis, may be the heart, the gut, and other energetic centers in the body. Recent science has even suggested that the heart and the gut have their own cognitive capacities which function and control the operations of the brain/mind. While I personally, at this point, am not in a position to confirm this or not, I do think it wise to see the validity of Plato's theorem and still not need to follow the explicit nature of his philosophy entirely. In conclusion, when we really look clearly at Plato's form of the good, it quite simply is a sort of visionary blessing which truth seekers can receive. It's like a transcendental insight into the nature of the world, which seems to be a very ubiquitous notion across the various traditions of wisdom found in the global polyculture. People with access to this sort of insight are able to understand things about the world without necessarily requiring proofs. In addition, it's generally corroborated that this profound degree of blessed insight can be cultivated, and there are many methods to doing so. I made this video because I believe that Plato truly was a master of philosophy and a great writer and influencer of the trajectory of Western civilization. I also think that many people have a skewed or untrue opinion about the nature of Western philosophy as we know it today. It's my opinion that for a European descendant or any modern person to not know Plato's essential contribution in philosophy is like not knowing the hometown where you were born. Sure, you can get by and it may not affect too much, but do you really know where you're going if you don't know where you came from? His thought is an absolute pearl of wisdom, which the Western tradition concocted, and I feel honored to have been able to create this content about him.
Welcome to the Observatory.